The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. She was supposed to die on the last night of October. The wizarding world had commemorated it ever since, painted her face on memorial plates, pressed it into commemorative portraits, made it the founding myth of an entire era of peace, a mother's love, a sacrifice. The moment one woman stepped between her child and the most powerful dark wizard in a century, and was consumed by the force she refused to deflect. They had the shape of it right, the love part, the refusal part. They had the ending completely wrong. 3 months before that night, in a safe house study that smelled of beeswax and alchemical residue, and something sharper than either, Lily Evans Potter was not preparing to die. She was preparing to survive it, which is a different undertaking entirely, and considerably more complicated. Her red hair was pinned back with a forgotten quill. Ink marked her left wrist and her right cheekbone. Nowhere else, because she was precise even in chaos. The candles had burned to stubs. She hadn't noticed. The diagram spread across the parchment before her was dense enough that it resembled, at first glance, a language no living throat had spoken aloud in centuries. Alchemical markers, blood anchor vectors, and at the center, drawn in deliberate strokes, a cradle. James appeared in the doorway the way he always did when she worked too late. Part admiration, part a worry he didn't know how to name yet. "You can't ward against a killing curse, Lils." He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "It doesn't work that way. I'm not trying to block it." She held up the diagram without looking away from it. "I'm trying to become it." He crossed the room and took the parchment from her hands. His expression moved through several things in rapid succession: confusion, then comprehension, then the particular stillness of a man who has understood something and is deciding how to hold it. "If I anchor my blood into his magic," she said, "not as a sacrifice, not as a death, but as a living thread woven into his core before anything happens, the curse won't kill Harry. It will return to its caster." James set the parchment down carefully, the way you set down something that has changed weight. "And what happens to you?" She looked up at him then. The expression on her face was not resignation, and it was not fear. It was the expression of a woman who had run every calculation available to her, and knew precisely what the numbers said. "I stun it," she said. 10 seconds is all I need." He looked at her for a long moment, that look she had memorized, the one that lived somewhere between "I believe you" and "please don't make me watch this." And then he sat down beside her and said, quietly, "Tell me what you need from me." She told him. The door came off its hinges in one movement, wood and plaster and cold October air arriving together, and James Potter turned from the stairs with his wand already raised and his face carrying the particular calm she had always recognized as the stillness of a man who had already decided what he was doing and had made peace with it. He was buying time. He knew the plan. He trusted her completely. He bought 7 seconds. He fell. Lily was already at the crib. She heard the stairs creak under the weight of something wrong. She heard the nursery door give. She didn't turn toward James. Couldn't, not yet, not until this was finished. So she turned to Harry instead. 11 months old, awake and watching her with his father's eyes and an expression of inexplicable calm that would, much later, make her understand that he had always been extraordinary in ways no classroom would ever adequately measure. "It's all right," she told him. Her voice didn't shake. "I've got you." The nursery door opened. Voldemort was tall in the way that things stripped of all warmth are tall, like a tree struck by lightning. Still standing, everything soft burned clean away. His eyes were red in the candlelight, and they moved from the crib to Lily and stayed. "Step aside," he said. His voice was soft. That was always the part people forgot to mention in every account she had ever read. How soft it was, how it arrived like something reasonable. "Step aside, girl." Lily stepped forward instead. She spread her arms in invocation, not supplication, which is a different thing entirely, and she spoke words that were not a Hogwarts spell. They were older than any ministry designation, older than any wand-based framework, drawn from a single handwritten text that had survived on the deepest shelf of the Potter family library for 400 years. "I invoke the anchor of House Potter," she said, "by law older than any ministry, older than any wand. I give not my death, but my living love." The curse hit her chest. The room went gold. Not the warm gold of candlelight. Something structural, light with actual mass behind it, and Voldemort had time to see the reflection was wrong, the angle was wrong, that something was happening which had no counter in any library he had studied, because it was not a shield, and not a deflection but a transmutation. She had transmuted herself into a mirror. The curse came back. His body was destroyed in the way dark things are destroyed when the force that built them is turned against itself. Quickly, without dignity, with a sound like every door in the world slamming shut at once. The wraith that remained, howling, formless, unfixed, hung in the ruined air of the nursery, disoriented, searching for something solid to cling to. Lily was already moving. She had 10 seconds before it stabilized. She grabbed Harry, pressed him against her chest, and she cast, not the Fidelius, not yet, something older, a Potter family spatial working so obscure, it appeared in one document written long before the ministry existed. The ward fold. She had practiced it in the manor's stone cellar for 6 weeks, until she could execute it one-handed with a sleeping infant pressed to her shoulder. The nursery folded. Not collapsed, folded the way a letter folds along a prepared crease, the interior of the room moving along a line in space she had anchored months in advance to a specific stone floor in Wales. She landed in a torch-lit hallway, cold stone under her feet. The torches flared to life along the walls in response to her blood signature, which they had been patiently waiting to recognize. Erie Manor. Harry was still awake. He looked up at her with those calm, impossible eyes, and something in his expression was so entirely James, that easy, unperturbed watchfulness, that she felt it in the center of her chest like a physical blow. "Hello," Lily said, very quietly. Her voice shook now. She let it. There was no one to be steady for, just for this moment. "Hello, my love. We're somewhere safe." Her legs made a decision without consulting her. She sat down on the cold stone floor and held him and listened to the silence of a house that was old and sealed, and entirely hers. In the ancient scrying bowl on the manor's second shelf, the image arrived without being asked. Godric's Hollow. Hagrid on Sirius's motorbike, his great frame folding as he knelt in the rubble. The sound he made was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when words have not been invented for the particular shape of a loss. He carried James inside with the tenderness of someone who understood that tenderness was the only thing left to offer. Then, Dumbledore, moving through the ruin of the ground floor, his face doing something she had never seen it do in all the years she had known him. Crumpling was the only word that fit. The great Albus Dumbledore, crumpling in an empty room. In the nursery, the backwash of the spell had burned a shape into the floorboards, the outline of a woman standing with her arms spread, no body. The impression was clear enough. Lily watched Dumbledore look at it. She watched him understand what he thought it meant. She could break the Fidelius. It was hers to break. She had cast it on herself. She was the secret keeper of her own survival, and a single word would undo it. One word and she could be there, in the rubble, and Hagrid would stop making that sound, and Dumbledore's face would reassemble itself into something she recognized. She thought about the wraith, loose in the world, looking for a host. She thought about the leak, about Godric's Hollow being found with surgical precision, the specific knowledge of which wards held, which didn't, what to hit first. That level of intelligence required someone inside Dumbledore's planning circle. She did not know whether the rot was within the order, or whether it went deeper, and she could not know from here, in the dark, with a sleeping child against her shoulder. She couldn't risk being wrong. She turned away from the bowl. Harry had fallen asleep against her collarbone, breathing with the steadiness of a child who had passed through something cataclysmic without knowing it, which was perhaps the only mercy the night had available to give. She carried him to the cot she had prepared at the end of the hall. She laid him down. She covered him with the blanket she had packed 3 weeks ago, when she had allowed herself to finally believe she might need it. Then she sat in the chair beside the cot, took a book from the shelf above it, opened it, and began to read. Outside, the wizarding world was waking up, celebrating, hanging the Potters' portraits in pub windows and calling it a miracle. In a weary manner, beside a sleeping child, Lily Potter was not dead. Her son breathed, the torches burned low and steady. There was work to do. The first winter was the quietest thing she had ever lived through, and she had lived through quiet winters. No owls, no flu, no voice in the house but hers, and eventually, gratefully, Harry's, first the formless sounds of an infant finding the edges of language, then single words, then 2 at a time, then whole sentences arriving fully formed, as though he had been composing them for weeks before deciding to release them. She noticed early that he thought before he spoke. She wondered, watching him, where he had learned that. Not from his father. She catalogued the library while he slept. It occupied the entire east wing of the manor, 3 rooms deep, shelved floor to ceiling in dark oak gone nearly black with age. She had known it existed. She had not known its scope. Volume by volume, through the long silences of that first season, she sorted them by discipline and century, and a third category she labeled simply danger, for which she prepared a separate blood-locked shelf. What she found in those rooms remade her understanding of what magic was. Not the magic Hogwarts taught, structured, repeatable, built on the Ministry's standardized framework of wand and incantation and measurable result. That magic was a tool, and she had been exceptional at it. But the Potter family had been collecting texts since before the Ministry existed, and those texts described something older and less tidy, and considerably more consequential. Magic, not as a set of techniques, but as a relationship, between the practitioner and their own nature, between intention and matter, between old agreements and the world that had partially forgotten them. She found the Peverell documents in the gray heart of that first winter. They were in a locked case at the back of the 3rd room, sealed with a charm that responded to bloodline rather than password. When she touched the case, it opened as though it had been waiting. She stood before it for a long moment before reaching inside. The documents were not dramatic. They were administrative, land records, Wizengamot correspondence, and a family charter written in the early 17th century that outlined, in dense legal language, the full entitlements of the House of Peverell under ancient wizarding law. She read the charter 4 times, each reading slower than the last. The House of Peverell's Wizengamot seat had been dormant since the 1600s. It had not been dissolved, it had not been revoked. It had simply been forgotten the way things are forgotten when everyone who remembers them is dead. She flagged the relevant pages. She built a file. She began writing letters under an alias to a solicitor in Edinburgh who specialized in ancient house law, asking careful questions about dormancy periods, reactivation procedures, and what weight a Founders-era charter carried in a modern Wizengamot session. The solicitor's answers arrived by Muggle post, forwarded through a chain she had constructed to be untraceable. They were, uniformly, more interesting than she had dared hope. She kept building the file. She kept reading. She began, cautiously, to understand the shape of what she was going to build. Harry said his first word on a Thursday morning in late winter, sitting on the library floor surrounded by picture books she had transfigured from blank parchment. Sturdy board editions with bright colors and rounded corners. The word was book. Lily looked at him from across the room and felt something move through her chest that had nothing whatsoever to do with strategy. Yes, she said. Book. Good. He held it up to show her, in case she had missed it. Very good, she said, and went back to the Peverell documents, and the quiet between them was the quiet of 2 people who were comfortable in the same space, which was not something she had expected to feel again for a very long time. And she was grateful for it in a way she couldn't have put into words for anyone who asked. The FlareNet detection ward pulsed in the dead of a February night, nearly 2 years after Harry first walked steadily enough to knock books off shelves he wasn't supposed to reach. Lily was awake. She was often awake in the small hours of February. It was one of the less pleasant habits isolation had given her. And she felt the resonance in the blood anchor before the spelled silver disc on her desk confirmed the signature. She read it carefully. A child. Approximately 4 years old. The magical core igniting for the first time was not, as these events typically were, a messy overflow of emotional pressure. It was almost coherent, almost intentional. The magic had moved like a thought completing itself, which was something she had read about in theory and was now reading in reality for the first time. Location: a suburb of Oxford. She wrote down the time, the coordinates, the signature quality. Beneath it she made a note in her smallest handwriting: cognitive link, watch. She watched for 2 years. Then she went to a white townhouse in Headington on a gray afternoon, carrying a tin of shortbread, because she was strategic about first impressions and because people who opened their doors to strangers carrying baked goods instinctively recalibrated their initial wariness. It was a small advantage, but she had learned to collect small advantages. Jean Granger answered the door. She was a neat, Composed woman with her daughter's eyes and the expression of someone who had spent 6 years watching their child be quietly extraordinary and quietly lonely in equal measure, and had learned to hold both things without letting either consume her. She looked at Lily, she looked at the shortbread, she stepped back and held the door open without a word, which was either exceptional intuition or exceptional manners, and Lily was grateful for either. Hermione was on the sitting room floor with a book, wearing small round glasses that sat slightly crooked on her nose. 6 years old, reading with the focused stillness of someone who had learned that if she was very quiet, adults sometimes forgot she was there and had interesting conversations above her head. She looked up when Lily came in, and she did not go back to her book. The conversation with Jean and Dan Granger lasted 3 hours. Lily told them everything: the wizarding world, Hogwarts, the Book of Admittance, what Hermione's magical signature meant, and what it would mean when the letter arrived by owl in 5 years. She told them what she was offering: a second household, not a replacement, a library. A companion for a child who did not yet have the vocabulary for what she was, but already felt the edges of it. A world that would not require their daughter to be smaller than she was. Dan Granger asked careful, precise questions. He was a man who approached the unfamiliar with methodical curiosity rather than fear, and each question was better than the last. Jean listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on Lily's face the entire time, reading her the way Lily had learned to read old documents, looking for the places where the surface didn't match what lived underneath. At the end, Hermione closed her book. "If I go," she said, "do I get to keep my books?" "You get my library," Lily said. 3,000 volumes, several of which are technically illegal. Hermione turned to her mother with the expression of someone who had already decided and was simply waiting for permission to say so out loud. "I want to go." Jean looked at her daughter for a long moment, the look of a woman measuring something she had no instrument for. Then she looked at Lily. "You'll write to us," she said. It was not a question. "Every week," Lily said, "and you'll visit. That's not negotiable. It's part of the arrangement, not a courtesy." Jean Granger nodded once. The way she nodded was the way Hermione would nod, years later, when she had processed something difficult and arrived at the only logical conclusion. Lily recognized it immediately and felt, for the first time since the autumn of 1981, something she cautiously identified as relief. What happened next was 5 years, and the 5 years were the best thing Lily had ever built. She taught them magic as a language before she taught it as a discipline. The Hogwarts method, all mechanics before meaning, incantation before understanding, she had decided was wrong. She had Harry and Hermione sit with their hands flat on the library table and learn to feel their own magical cores as physical sensation first. Heat in the sternum, current along the forearms, the field each of them generated, distinct, entirely their own. Harry's magic was warm and fast, and slightly reckless, something alive that wanted to move before it had a destination. He could levitate objects without speaking before his 7th birthday, not because he had technique, but because he forgot, occasionally, that technique was supposed to be required. Hermione's magic was structured even before she had structures to put it in. She built frameworks in her mind, a slight stillness before casting, an organizing thought forming like a sentence before it was spoken, and then executed through them with a precision that made Lily stop teaching on 3 separate occasions just to write down what she was witnessing. Together they were something she had read about in the texts on twin soul resonance, and had not quite believed until she saw it. Harry's instinct caught what Hermione's framework missed. Her precision held what his warmth would have let run too hot. 2 instruments finding the same note from different directions. She called them the sword and the shield in the early months, half affectionately, half accurately. The names stuck. She taught them wandless technique in their 2nd year of study. She taught them the history of what they were practicing, which was longer and stranger and more consequential than the standard curriculum had ever suggested. She taught them defensive theory rooted in intention rather than reflex, and the marauder map reading her late husband had developed with Sirius that treated every unknown space as a problem to be solved before it became one to be survived. She was a good teacher. She had not known this about herself, not fully, until she had students. In the summer of Harry's 5th year, nearly 4 years after Godric's Hollow, Sirius Black escaped Azkaban. He had discovered, across those years of gray stone and gray sea and the gray press of Dementors, that they could not reach him when he became the dog. The emotions they fed on were human things, complex, weighted with language and memory, and the particular grief of knowing what you had lost. Padfoot felt them only as distant weather, something happening in another country. He had made the change on a winter night, when the Dementors drifted inland following a cluster of fishing vessels, and he had walked out through the main gate and not looked back. Finding the manor took 3 months. He found it through a channel that only a marauder would have known to look for. An emergency ward signal woven into the stone of Ariri Manor that James and Sirius and Remus had designed together years before the Fidelius, a pattern in the ley lines beneath the Welsh hills that Lily had activated deliberately the night she arrived. She had left it open deliberately, quietly, not knowing if anyone would ever need it, or if anyone would still be alive and free enough to follow it. She had left it open because hope is a habit, and she had decided early to maintain the habit. He arrived thin and wild-eyed, and not yet entirely himself. He sat at the kitchen table for 4 days without saying anything substantial. On the 5th morning, he ate a full breakfast, looked across the table at Harry, and made a decision so visible on his face that Lily found a reason to look somewhere else for a moment, to give him the privacy of it. His recovery was not quick. 12 years in Azkaban leaves marks that don't resolve in seasons, and he was honest about this in the way people are honest when they have spent too long with nothing but their own thoughts. But Harry had a way of reaching people without trying, some quality of steady, uncomplicated welcome that he had inherited from James and refined into something entirely his own, and Hermione had a way of handing him books without comment. Exactly the right ones, which was her particular language of care. He began, slowly, to resemble the person Lily had known. He taught them things she couldn't: the marauder philosophy, every exit before every entrance, the shape of a room before you trusted it, the art of being still in a way that didn't look like hiding. He taught Hermione to trust her instincts, even when they outran her framework, which was harder and took longer and became one of the more important things she ever learned. The library evenings became a family institution properly, once Hermione had been at the manor long enough to develop opinions about shelf organization, which took a fortnight. After that, all 4 of them settled into the East Wing in the hours between dinner and sleep. Sirius reading with his feet up, and usually asleep before the 3rd chapter. Harry and Hermione working through whatever had caught their joint attention. Lily, always with more to read than hours available. The Welsh hills were dark beyond the windows. The fire burned low. The manor held all of it. The morning of their departure for Hogwarts arrived quietly, as important mornings always did at Airy Manor. Gray Welsh light through the stone windows, and the smell of tea already moving through the corridors before anyone had asked for it. Harry came downstairs at 7 in his robes, and Lily, at the stove, felt before she turned that it was going to be one of those mornings. The ones where something in the set of his shoulders or the angle of his head was so entirely James that she needed a moment before she could speak normally. She took the moment. "You've got ink on your collar," she said, without turning. "I know. Fix it." He fixed it wandlessly, a flicker of attention, a warm pulse she felt from across the room without looking. And it was done. She heard the small, satisfied sound he made afterward, the one he didn't know he made, and allowed herself 4 seconds of something that lived in the neighborhood of sentiment without quite being it. Hermione arrived already carrying a book, her robes a deep burgundy she had selected after what Lily recalled as a 40-minute deliberation between 5 very similar options. She set the book face down on the table with the reluctant care of someone who hadn't quite finished the chapter and was having feelings about it. "You'll have 3 hours on the train," Lily said. "I know." Hermione sat. "I've packed 9 others." Sirius came in last, too cheerful for the hour, in robes slightly too well tailored for a Tuesday morning. He had spent 12 years in Azkaban and was still working through lost time in every available category. He poured tea for all 4 of them without being asked, sat at the head of the table, and looked around at them with an expression that he immediately rearranged into something more casual when he noticed Lily noticing it. "Don't," she said. "I'm not doing anything. You're about to say something sentimental." "Absolutely not." He drank his tea with great dignity. "I was going to observe that Harry's got ink on his collar. It's fixed," Harry said. "Good. Drink your tea." Lily dressed last. She stood in front of the mirror in her room and put on robes of deep green. Not Slytherin green, nothing so recent as that, but something older, the color of these hills in November. The color in the oldest Potter portraits, hanging in the library's back room. She fixed the Peverell circlet at her temple. Simple silver, the crest worn smooth, with centuries of handling by people she would never know. The woman in the mirror was 31 years old. She had been dead for 10 years officially. According to every record the wizarding world kept, she had never been more precisely, deliberately, exactly herself. Harry appeared in the doorway behind her. "Mum," he said, "you look like trouble." "I am trouble," she said. "Put your trunk in the cart." They arrived at King's Cross with 3 minutes to spare. This was deliberate. The barrier at platform 9 3/4 accepted them one at a time, Sirius first, then Hermione, then Harry. Lily went last, stepping through the way she did most things now, without hesitation, without performance, with only the quality of attention that meant she had already considered what waited on the other side and had decided to go through anyway. The platform came at her in layers, steam first, and coal smoke and the red length of the Hogwarts Express running the full platform. Then the noise, families and trunks and owls, and the overlapping frequency of 100 simultaneous conversations. Then the people, and the people were the thing she had been calculating since August. Arthur Weasley saw her first. He was 20 feet away, adjusting a trunk with the patient focus of a man accustomed to things not cooperating, and he turned at some peripheral prompting, and his face went the color of a man whose body had decided to handle the processing before his mind caught up. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Molly Weasley turned from Percy's collar. The sound she made was not a word. It was the sound of a framework collapsing and immediately rebuilding, faster than most people managed, which told Lily something useful about Molly Weasley. And then Molly's face was doing something complicated and bright, and entirely unguarded. The information moved across the platform the way a certain kind of news moves through a crowd that has been waiting for it without knowing. A sequential stilling, one cluster then another, students tugging sleeves, a father's hand dropping mid-gesture, a mother pressing her fingers to her mouth. The Hogwarts Express let out a long whistle, and nobody moved. Then Lucius Malfoy turned around. He turned because the silence had reached him, and Lucius Malfoy was a man who monitored the social temperature of any room he occupied, as a survival instinct honed over decades. He turned expecting to find the silence about him. He found Lily Evans Potter looking at him from 30 feet away. She said nothing. The reality was pleasantly consistent with her expectations. The color draining from his face, the cane stopping mid-motion, the slight rearrangement of posture that only someone who had studied him would read as a man recalculating from first principles. Draco Malfoy stood behind his father, staring at Harry. Harry looked back with the grounded attention of someone who had never been required to understand himself through this man's eyes. Draco felt something shift under that steady, uncurious gaze that he had no language for yet. He would find it eventually. "That's us," Harry said, and picked up his bag and turned to Hermione. They walked to the train together the way they walked everywhere, not in deliberate synchrony, but adjacent, comfortable, the space between them never having been a problem. The crowd parted, simply because two people were moving and everyone else was standing still. Lily watched them board. She stood on the emptying platform until the last carriage cleared the edge, smoke thinning in the autumn air. Sirius appeared beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the empty track. "Sure you don't want to come on the train? Dumbledore will want to meet privately. I'll be at the school before the sorting." "How?" She produced a small silver compass from her robe pocket. Peveril worked, its crest matching the one at her temple, glowing faintly in her palm with the cold, steady light of something that had been waiting a very long time to be used. "Ancient house transport rights," she said. "The Potter family has a standing invitation to Hogwarts from the Founders' Compact. I'm going to use it for the first time in 300 years. Sirius looked at the compass. He looked at her. "You've been planning to use that since you found the Peveril documents, haven't you?" "That first winter." "The day I read the charter," she confirmed. He made a sound that was mostly a laugh. "You are the most terrifying person I have ever met. You've said that. It keeps being true." Dumbledore was mid-sentence when she walked through his door. The gargoyle had not stopped her. The castle wards had not stopped her. The Founders' Compact gave her right of passage to every room in the castle that had existed before the 13th century, and Dumbledore's office was very old. And she had verified the architectural date in the Potter Library years in advance to be certain. He stopped speaking. The professor he had been talking to, Flitwick, she noted, who went slightly pink and very still, looked between them with the expression of a man who understood he was witnessing something with a clear before and a clear after. Dumbledore was not, as a general rule, speechless. He had weathered Grindelwald and a century of institutional politics that would have dismantled a lesser man. He was speechless now. She counted the seconds. 4 of them. "Hello, Albus," Lily said. "You'll want to sit down. We have quite a lot to discuss, and I'd prefer you to be seated when I explain what I know about the prophecy." The portraits on the walls woke one by one and watched in silence. The fire burned steady and orange. Dumbledore sat down. The Sorting Hat was old enough to remember things that had no names anymore. Harry sat on the stool. McGonagall lowered the hat onto his head, and it dropped over his eyes, and 400 people decided simultaneously not to breathe. Inside the dark, the hat was still for a moment. Then, quietly, in the space only Harry could hear, "Remarkable." Harry waited. "I've seen preparation before. Ambition, raw courage, various configurations of intelligence. I haven't seen this. A corps trained to this depth. A lineage this old, sitting on a first-year stool in borrowed robes." A pause, neither hurried nor performed. "You could go anywhere, boy. Anywhere at all." "I know." Harry thought back without drama. "Does that not interest you?" "Not especially. I'd like to go where I belong." 3 seconds. Then the hat called out, in a voice that rang through the hall with unusual resonance. Not the brisk declaration it gave most students, but something fuller, as though the word itself carried weight it wasn't always required to carry. "Gryffindor," the Gryffindor table erupted. Harry pulled the hat from his head and handed it back to McGonagall with a nod that she received with the fractional widening of eyes that constituted, for Minerva McGonagall, open astonishment, and walked to his table with the easy, unself-conscious stride of someone arriving somewhere he had always been going. At the staff table, Severus Snape had been watching the doors since 7 o'clock. He had not looked at Harry directly. He watched the wall behind the Gryffindor table, and kept his face the way he kept his face when the thing required of him was absolute stillness. Hermione sat on the stool. The hat considered her for 4 seconds, long enough that the hall, having calibrated on Harry, decided 4 seconds was the new threshold for significance. Gryffindor. She walked to the table, sat beside Harry, and opened the notebook she had been carrying in her robe pocket. The look that passed between them was the look of 2 people confirming something they had already been certain of. The sorting continued. Food appeared. At the end of the staff table, in a chair she had conjured herself, exercising the ancient house right to provide her own seating in any Hogwarts space built before the 14th century, which this hall was, Lily Potter ate her dinner and watched Quirinus Quirrell at the far end of the table, and felt, from across the room, the cold signature she had been expecting since she read Snape's first intelligence report in August. A fragmented soul, clinging to a living host, patient, building, waiting for what it had come here to take. She made a note on the back of her napkin. Then she ate her pudding and waited for the opportunity to move first. The first year at Hogwarts unfolded the way a stage sets itself, quietly, with everyone present feeling that something was being arranged without being able to name it. Quirrell taught defense against the dark arts in short sentences, and a stutter calibrated to deflect attention from the intelligence living behind his eyes. The students found him pitiable. Lily found him precise, in the way that things operated by a brilliant and patient mind are precise. She monitored the cold signature weekly. It was building toward the stone, and she let it build because she had already located the trapdoor on the 3rd-floor corridor in September and had spent 3 evenings studying what lay beneath it. Neville Longbottom was in Harry's year, in Harry's house, and Lily watched him with a particular attention she kept carefully to herself. In another version of events, one decided by the accident of a birth date, it might have been Neville sitting in a hidden manor in Wales, with a scar on his forehead. She thought about Frank and Alice Longbottom, in St. Mungo's, locked behind eyes that no longer recognized anyone, and she added their names to the list of things that would be addressed when she had the standing to address them. Neville, for his part, was a gentle child, growing quietly and without fanfare, into someone considerably braver than anyone around him had yet noticed. Harry and Hermione adapted to Hogwarts, the way people adapt to a new city when they arrive with a map and the local language already under their belts. They had a foundation, and foundations matter. In December, when the castle's population had thinned to a quiet handful, Lily moved. The Cerberus, fluffy Hagrid's, enormous enough that 2 of its 3 heads had to angle sideways to fit the corridor, responded to a sustained pattern in the key of F major, played on a small wooden flute she had prepared after reading a text on magical creature behavioral acoustics. All three heads lowered. She stepped over the trapdoor and dropped through. The devil's snare reached for her in the dark below. She lit her hand wandlessly. Clean white light. And it recoiled from the brightness with the slow reluctance of something that had not had cause to fear in a long time. She was through before it recalibrated. The key room. Hundreds of winged keys circling in the slow patterns of a sustained locomotion charm, their silver wings catching the torchlight. One with a damaged wing, flying a broken orbit near the east wall. She watched the pattern for 30 seconds, identified the lock by the scratching on its keyhole's upper rim, then cast a focused accio, not at the key itself, but at the space in front of the lock, redirecting the broken orbit into the correct trajectory. The door opened. The chess set in the following room was genuinely impressive. Autonomous pieces, a self-sustaining enchantment that responded to threat with calculated aggression. She walked along the wall to the far door and used the ancient house passage right to open it, which the chess enchantment did not account for because it had been designed to stop students, and the passage right predated its parameters by several centuries. The troll was unconscious. She stepped around it without comment. The next room held 6 bottles arranged on a stone ledge, black fire blocking the way forward and purple fire blocking the way back, a rolled parchment on the floor explaining the logic of the puzzle. She read it once. She had been practicing logic and alchemical reasoning for the better part of a decade. She identified the correct bottle in 40 seconds, took a single measured swallow, and walked through the black flames with her eyes open. The mirror of Erised stood against the far wall, its inscription running across the top in the reversed text she had learned to read correctly at 14. Erised stra eru oit, ube kafru oit, onwoshi. She hadn't needed it translated then, and she didn't need it now. She stood before it. The mirror showed her a garden, Eriri Manor in summer, the light amber and long. Harry was there, laughing at something she couldn't hear, with his father's hands and his own particular brightness. Hermione was beside him, gesturing with a book in a way that suggested she was making a point and making it well. Sirius was there, and James, still young, still with the slightly chaotic hair she had described in the margin of a potions essay and never shown him, and other people she didn't recognize yet, people who would exist in a future she hadn't finished building. And they were all together, and the woman at the center of all of it, the woman they were all arranged around, was her. She looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she reached along the mirror's frame to the seam where the enchantment had a join. Because every working has a point where one intention ends and another begins. And Dumbledore was brilliant, but he had designed this trap for someone motivated by wanting, and she was not that person. She was motivated by the practical necessity of removing a dangerous object from a building that contained her children. The stone came out of the concealment space behind the frame's left edge, deep red, roughly the size of a large walnut, warm in a way that had nothing to do with ambient temperature. "I'm sorry, Nicholas," she said quietly, to the empty room. She pocketed it and walked back through the potions room. The puzzle reset itself behind her with a soft sound like settling glass, and climbed back to the surface. She placed the stone on Dumbledore's desk the next morning without preamble. It sat between them in the early light. He looked at it. He looked at her. The recalculation she had watched him make in September happened again, faster this time because he had been practicing it. "Lily," he began, "how did you—" Fluffy responds to any sustained pattern in F major. The devil's snare was treated with weed killer residue detectable from 20 feet. Your key room uses a fixed locomotion orbit. The broken-winged key's deviation is predictable after 30 seconds of observation. The chess enchantment was designed to stop students, and my passage rights predate its parameters. The potions puzzle is elegant logic, and I have been practicing logic for a long time." She sat down. "Your mirror trap is the only genuinely elegant one. It assumes the retriever is motivated by desire. I am motivated by responsibility. Those are different things." Dumbledore was quiet, in the way of a man who is genuinely quiet rather than theatrically so. "There is a possessed professor in this building," she continued. "Quirrell is hosting Voldemort's shade. I identified it in October. The signature is consistent with a fragmented soul clinging to a living host. You either know this and are allowing it because it serves some larger purpose, or your intelligence network has failed." She let that sit a moment. "Either answer's a problem. Lily, the larger picture requires—" "My son is 11 years old." Her voice did not change in volume or temperature. It became the kind of quiet that has physical weight. There is no larger picture that contains that fact and emerges having prioritized anything else. Not for me, not from where I'm standing. She stood. The stone goes back to Flamel through Gringotts, under Potterhouse seal by the end of this week. Quirrell is managed before Christmas. The method I leave to you, but I want confirmation when it's done. And Albus. She waited until he looked at her fully, not at the stone, not at the middle distance, but at her face. You will not use my children as coordinates in a plan again. Not even for the greater good. I understand the greater good. I have been building toward it since October of 1981. My children are not its infrastructure. She moved toward the door. I loved you, she said, the way a student loves the person who first showed them what they were capable of. Don't make me revise that. She left. Behind her the stone sat on the desk in the morning light. Dumbledore picked it up with hands that were, for the first time in many years, not entirely steady. The portraits watched him. None of them spoke. The castle emptied over the last week of term, until by Christmas Eve the corridors held their breath. Harry and Hermione stayed, as they always would in years when Lily was on the grounds, and the castle produced quarters for them in the East Tower with the easy generosity of a very old building that remembers what hospitality means. Lily waited until 8:30. Then she walked to the dungeons. No note, no appointment. An appointment would have given him time to build something, and what she needed from this conversation required that he arrive at it unfortified. His door was heavy oak. She knocked twice, a long pause, long enough that she thought he might not be in. Then the door opened. Severus Snape stood in his teaching robes with ink on his left cuff and a stack of first-year essays on the desk behind him, and an expression on his face that was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him since they were 9 years old, and he had shown her, in a hollow by the river's edge, that he could make a dandelion's petals move without touching them. He had not been expecting this. If he had been expecting it, he would have prepared for it. What was on his face right now was something that no amount of preparation could have prevented. Lily, he said, barely above a whisper, a register she had not heard from him since before Hogwarts, before everything else had settled around him and become the surface he showed the world. "May I come in?" she said. He stepped back. She entered. The door closed. She took the chair on the student side of his desk, a choice she saw him register, confirming she was not arranging the space as adversarial. He sat in his own chair because his legs had made a decision without his input. The fire in the grate was low. Outside the dungeon's narrow windows, snow had been falling since afternoon. "How long?" he said, when the silence had gone long enough to breathe. "Since that night, I had a working prepared. I couldn't tell anyone. The fewer who knew, the tighter the Fidelius held. You let me believe." He stopped. Something tightened in his jaw. "For 10 years. Yes." A log settled in the fire. "I spent 10 years making amends," he said, with the precision of a man for whom precision had become structural. Whatever Dumbledore asked. "Because you died. Because I told him about the prophecy. And you died, and that was the accounting." He looked at the desk rather than at her. "My debt. 10 years of it. I know. Why are you telling me this? Because my son is in your potions class," she said. "And you've been punishing him for the way he holds his cauldron and the width of his shoulders, none of which he chose, all of which remind you of someone you chose to hate because hating was simpler than the alternative." Silence. "I need to know whether that changes," she said. "If it cannot, if what he represents to you is fixed, then we have a different conversation." He stood. Snape, when cornered by something true, always needed the room to be a different size. He walked to the window. The snow came down sideways over the lake. "He looks exactly like James," he said. "In the first potions lesson, he caught a glass I knocked off the desk. Wandless reflex. And he looked at me afterward exactly the way James looked at every Quidditch catch, like the world had confirmed something he already knew about himself." A pause. "I took 2 points from Gryffindor. I know that too. The Granger girl is also mine," Lily said. "She came to me at 6 years old with a book under her arm, and has been mine since that afternoon." He turned from the window. She looked at him. This man who had been her first friend, and then her lost friend, and then the person whose choices had led, by a chain neither of them predicted, to a night in Godric's Hollow. And she looked at all of it at once. The full, complicated accounting of a person who had made catastrophic choices, and spent a decade paying for them in the dark, now looking at her like someone whose grief had just been told it was built on a lie. "What do you want from me, Lily?" he said. "The truth. Are you Dumbledore's instrument, or are you your own? The fire twice, the wind once. I was yours," he said finally, quietly. "For a long time I believed that was the same thing as being his. And now? And now I have spent 4 months watching his son receive potions instruction and taking points from Gryffindor for wandless reflexes." He met her eyes. "I don't know what I am. I'm not asking for loyalty. I'm asking for something smaller and harder. My children are in this building. There is a moment coming, while Voldemort exists in any form, when Dumbledore's calculation of the greater good will place them inside an acceptable margin of loss. I need to know that when that moment arrives, you will not be standing inside his calculation." He looked at her for a long time. "I will not let them die," he said. The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. "On your magic," she said. He did not hesitate. "On my magic." She crossed to him and took his left hand, the ink-stained one, the one that had brewed potions in this dungeon for a decade on behalf of a dead woman's memory. She held it for a moment. Not forgiveness, not reunion. Something more durable than either. "Thank you, Severus," she said. She left. He stood where she had left him for a long time. The essays on his desk remained ungraded. Outside, snow came down over the Black Lake, and Severus Snape sat back down and understood, for the first time in 10 years, that the accounting he had been running would need an entirely new ledger. The second year arrived with the energy of a castle that had survived one crisis and didn't know yet it was building toward another. At the second opening feast, Lily took her customary seat at the end of the staff table, conjured, as always, under the ancient house rite, and noted the man in powder blue sitting in the chair that had, 11 months earlier, belonged to Quirinus Quirrell, who had met his end in the most fundamental way available to a man, hosting something that didn't want to share his skull. The manner of that ending was one of the two things she had chosen to leave in Dumbledore's hands, and he had handled it before Easter. She had received the confirmation she'd asked for. Gilderoy Lockhart had been talking for 11 minutes. He was positioned at the center of the staff table, with the comfortable presence of a man who believed that attention directed at him was indistinguishable from respect for him, and he was explaining to the first years nearest the high table the precise methodology of his encounter with the Wagga Wagga werewolf, an encounter that had appeared in Chapter 4 of Magical Me, and was now being performed with additional hand gestures and extended eye contact with individual students. Lily set down her water glass. She stood. The hall noticed before she spoke. The moment had a quality of inevitability. She was wearing the Peverell circlet that caught the candlelight at a particular angle. She was a woman many of these students had grown up seeing on commemorative plates, and she was standing without being asked to stand. By the time she opened her mouth, 400 people had already gone quiet. "I apologize for interrupting," she said. "As the lady of the ancient and noble house of Potter and co-regent of the dormant house of Peverell, I invoke Section 12 of the Hogwarts Founders' Compact, the clause of academic fitness." She placed a scroll on the staff table. It was thick, and it landed with the sound of years. "I formally challenge the appointment of Professor Gilderoy Lockhart to the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts, on the grounds that his academic credentials are fraudulent." She placed a second scroll beside the first. The attached documentation consists of 47 sworn magical testimonies from witches and wizards across 4 continents, who confirm that Professor Lockhart used memory charms to steal credit for their work. The Norwegian wizard whose werewolf encounter became Chapter 4. The healer from Burkina Faso whose vampire engagement he claimed as his own. The Albanian cursebreaker whose work he published under his name with her consent. Nowhere in evidence. These testimonies were gathered independently of ministry channels and verified by a neutral third-party pensieve panel in August of this year. Lockhart's smile developed a structural problem. It remained in approximately the right position, but lost the internal architecture that made it a smile. Under the Founders' Compact, an individual whose documented credentials are fraudulent may not hold a teaching position at Hogwarts without full review by the Ancient House representatives. As the only active Ancient House representative currently present, she spread her hands, a gesture both reasonable and absolute. "I move that his appointment be suspended pending review. The motion is uncontested." She looked at him directly. The motion passes. Lockhart opened his mouth. What emerged was not a sentence. Minerva McGonagall was already moving from her chair with the expression of a woman who had wanted this exact outcome since the appointment letter arrived in August, and who was going to conduct it with absolute professional dignity, which she did, guiding Lockhart from the hall with a hand at his elbow and a pace that left no room for interpretation. The doors closed behind them. Lily sat back down. At the Gryffindor table, Ron Weasley leaned across to Harry and said in a whisper that carried to approximately 2 tables in either direction, "Is she always like that?" "Yes," Harry said. "Brilliant," said Ron, with the whole-body conviction of a 12-year-old who had just seen something he would be describing to people for years. 2 days after that, the Board of Governors met in a long room off the third-floor corridor. Lucius Malfoy had called the meeting. He sat at the head of the table in robes that communicated, through their tailoring alone, that he considered the other people in the room temporary furniture. He had framed the meeting as a discussion of the irregular presence of an outside party in school governance. The outside party was sitting across from him, with a leather briefcase on the table, and the patience of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. She let him speak for 4 minutes. Then she opened the briefcase. "Mr. Malfoy, you have served on this board since the mid-1980s, using your position to influence curriculum decisions, personnel appointments, and library access in ways that consistently benefited interests aligned with the previous regime." She placed the first set of papers on the table, color-coded, green for financial records, blue for correspondence, red for items that were not merely irregular, but criminal. "Your financial records for the same period were extracted by my Gringotts liaison under the Potter family's standing audit rights, the right that exists in the same house charter your attorneys apparently neglected to review." A second set, then a third. "You donated 60,000 galleons to the Daily Prophet conditional on Death Eater trial coverage, omitting your name. You acquired 3 board seats through third-party proxies, whose properties you hold mortgages on, giving you effective representation of 9 votes against the governor's charter limit of 3 per family. And you inserted a clause into the school's equipment contract with Borgin and Burks, an establishment selling items prohibited under Ministry Dark Artifact regulations. This school has been in regulatory breach for 4 years. Because of you." She closed the briefcase. "I move to remove Lucius Malfoy from the board, with immediate effect. Under the Founders' Compact, an ancient House representative holds co-veto authority over all board appointments and may initiate removal on documented grounds." She folded her hands. "You may attempt to challenge this motion." Lucius Malfoy looked at the documents and made the calculation of a man who recognizes the moment clearly. He said nothing. The motion passed. The first petrification happened on a Tuesday in October. Mrs. Norris was found in the corridor outside the Great Hall, suspended in a stillness that was not death and not ordinary sleep. Filch's response was loud and accusatory and directed at the nearest students. Hermione looked at the stillness itself for approximately 4 seconds, noted the specific quality of it, and took out her notebook. By the end of the following week, when Colin Creevey was found in a similar state with his camera raised at the angle of someone looking through a lens rather than with direct eyes, she had a conclusion. She gave it to Lily on a Sunday morning in the Transfiguration courtyard, which had become their established location for things requiring full attention. "It's a basilisk," she said, while Lily was still reading the first page. "The petrification pattern is consistent with indirect sight exposure." Creevey was looking through his camera. "Nearly headless Nick is already dead," which altered the exposure threshold entirely. Justin Finch Fletchley saw it through Nick. 2 layers of separation, same result. She pointed to the diagram on the final page. "The oldest pipe network in the castle runs under the second-floor girls' bathroom. Moaning Myrtle's bathroom. The pipe diameter is consistent with a serpent of significant size." Lily set the analysis down and pressed her hand flat against it for a moment. The gesture she made when she was integrating something that required adjustment to the plan. "Go to your dormitory," she said. "Lock the door. I'll be back before morning." She went alone. A basilisk killed with direct eye contact and petrified with indirect. A second person in the chamber added a variable she was not willing to manage. She went alone. She found the sink with the carved serpent on its tap and spoke to it in the serpent caller register, a ritual tonal language she had spent 8 months learning from a druidic text so old the parchment had become translucent at its edges. Not parcel tongue, which was a hereditary gift that Salazar Slytherin had named and formalized. This was the ceremonial register that predated that formalization, the language in which serpents had been addressed by magical practitioners for 2,000 years before the founders were born. The sink responded the way very old things respond to being addressed in their original language, with a slow, structural recognition. The pipe opened. She went down. The Chamber of Secrets was vast in the way that Founders-era spaces sometimes are, proportions that suggested the architecture was not operating entirely under standard spatial law. Stone serpent columns rose floor to ceiling. Green light filtered through water above, giving everything the quality of being underwater without the resistance. Lily stood at the entrance and looked at what Salazar Slytherin had built as a gift, with care, made to last, and what a 16-year-old boy with a hollowed-out soul had eventually bent toward murder. She walked forward. The basilisk emerged from the shadows behind Slytherin's carved face with a movement less like a creature advancing and more like a section of the dark deciding to become solid. 60 feet. Scales the color of old bronze, worn smooth in places with centuries. Ancient in the way magic ages, not deteriorating, but deepening. Its eyes were closed. In the presence of something that addressed it correctly, a basilisk did not lead with its kill. The instinct to destroy was trained behavior, layered over something considerably older. The older thing was to listen. Lily spoke for 7 minutes. The chamber's stone columns held the sound. The basilisk did not move. What she said, in substance, "You have been used. You were made to guard, and guarding was bent into killing, and you have been alone in this stone for 1,000 years. I am not the boy who last came here. I am asking, not commanding, that you remember the difference between a guardian and a weapon, and choose." The basilisk's head lowered in an acknowledgement that was not submission, something between equals, one recognizing the register of the other. Then it spoke, in tonal shapes that overlapped enough with the serpent caller register that Lily could follow the outline of what was meant. The boy who last came spoke the words but held wrong intentions. "I did what was asked of me. I would not do it again." A pause, long enough to be deliberate. "You speak as one who has found the old agreements." "I found them," Lily said, "in a very old library." Something moved through the basilisk's expression that occupied the territory of amusement without quite being it. "Tell the speaker," it said, "that I am called Seraphine. Tell him I remember the one who built this place before the arguments began between them. I will know him when he comes." Lily found the diary on the way back, in a recess near the entrance, wrapped in silk that had become something else over centuries. She felt it before she touched it, the cold, familiar signature she had been monitoring in Harry's scar for 7 years. A soul fragment in an object, a Horcrux. She wrapped it in the silver-threaded cloth she carried for exactly this contingency and climbed back up the pipe. She placed the diary on Dumbledore's desk at 11 o'clock that night, without unwrapping it. It sat between them, cold through the cloth, the fire catching its silver edges. "How many, Albus?" she said. He looked at the diary. He looked at her. The recalculation moved through his expression. "How many what?" he said. "Horcruxes. How many has he made?" The silence that followed was the silence of a man deciding whether the woman across the desk from him had the right to know the answer. She watched him make the decision. "I believe 7, he said quietly. "In total." She sat down and pulled out her notebook. "Tell me what you know, what you've confirmed, and what you're inferring, in that order. Start with the ones you've already located." He began to talk. Outside the chamber, somewhere deep in the castle's stone, Seraphine coiled in the dark and waited for the speaker she had been promised was coming. The 6th false article about Muggle-born students appeared on a Thursday, and Lily read it at the kitchen table with her tea going cold. It was written in the register of journalism that never quite says what it means, dressing conclusions in the language of concern, so that what it meant arrived in readers' minds as their own thought rather than the writer's intention. She had seen the technique before. It was effective. It needed to stop. She wrote to Cassius Moon. Cassius Moon was 63, had practiced ancient house law for 38 years, and had the quality, rare in his profession, of becoming more still the more interesting a case became. She had retained him in the early months at the manor for a purpose she had not yet specified. He had been waiting a long time. He was, she thought, about to find the wait worthwhile. "I am ready to file," she wrote. "I want discovery, not settlement. All of it." 2 words came back by morning. "Understood. Proceed." The lawsuit was filed through the Wizarding Court of Civil Magical Disputes. rooms on the ministry's fourth floor that most employees had never visited. 17 claims of defamatory publication, each documented with original articles, factual corrections supported by primary sources, and sworn magical testimony. The discovery process took 6 weeks. Cassius arrived at the manor in May with a briefcase and the expression of a man who had been doing this for 38 years and was genuinely surprised. He laid the documents on the library table in 3 groups. The first, 14 editorial decisions over the previous decade in which coverage was altered following payments from identified external accounts. The second, the source accounts, a Malfoy family trust, a joint Gringotts account in the names Avery and Knott, and, set down with the particular care of something with significant temperature, an account linked to the Office of the Minister for Magic. Cornelius Fudge, 14 payments over 3 years, each preceding a favorable editorial decision by between 4 and 9 days. The third group was the internal correspondence, written in language so transparent it suggested the authors had never imagined it being read outside the room. Under wizarding media law, Lily said, a sitting minister's office making payments to a publication claiming political neutrality. Section 7 of the 1947 Press Integrity Statutes. Cassius said, a criminal offense. She picked up the Fudge correspondence, read it, set it down. I want a meeting with the minister under the ancient house right of direct address. The minister's office was furnished to communicate the weight of the institution. Fudge sat behind his desk in his lime green bowler hat with the composed expression of a man who had spent 2 decades learning to receive difficult information without showing that it was difficult. She let him speak first. 3 minutes of reassurances and framings, and the careful language of a politician buying time while reading terrain. She listened without interrupting, which she could see made him more uncomfortable than interruption would have. Then she opened the briefcase. You have 3 options, Minister. The first option was the International Confederation of Wizards, which had jurisdiction over national ministries in breach of their own statutory law and did not move quickly, but did move. And when it did, the process was public, and the documentation became part of the permanent international record. The second was the Wizengamot, where she had accumulated 6 unused Potterhouse proxy vetoes, any one sufficient to force a confidence review, and where she had the numbers for the vote itself. She placed a list of names on his desk, annotated in her handwriting, which he did not pick up. The third option required him to agree, in writing, witnessed by Cassius Moon and sealed under magical contract, to 3 items. Item 1. The prophet retracts and publicly corrects each of the 17 false or misleading articles identified in my filing. Corrections run on the front page for 3 consecutive editions. Item 2. You appoint an independent media oversight committee with subpoena power over any publication claiming political neutrality in its coverage of ministry affairs, the composition of which I have already selected and am prepared to defend. Item 3. You initiate a formal Wizengamot inquiry into the Death Eater trials conducted between 1981 and 1983, specifically those involving individuals imprisoned without formal charge or trial. I want Pettigrew's conviction on public record, with full documentation of how and why he evaded justice for 12 years. I want the wrongfully imprisoned reviewed by an independent panel within 12 months. And I want the findings published in full. Fudge read the third document again. It did not change between readings. And if I refuse? He said. Then we find out which of the first 2 options the Wizengamot prefers. She said, I am genuinely indifferent between them. The outcome is identical in all 3 cases. The variable is how much of your career survives the process. Outside his window, the ministry atrium was visible, witches and wizards moving through it in the ordinary flow of a working day. None of them aware that 4 floors above them, a man was sitting with a shorter list of choices than he had walked in expecting to have. Fudge signed. 3 weeks later, Lily received a letter from Lucius Malfoy's attorney outlining a legal challenge to the Potter family's Gringotts holdings under an obscure provision of a 19th century financial statute. She did not reply to the attorney. She wrote instead to Gringotts directly, to Iron Scales Department, the Potter Black Trust Consolidation. Please confirm it is finalized under Goblin financial law, as discussed. Iron Scales' response arrived that same afternoon. Confirmed. The Potter Black Trust has been registered under Goblin sovereignty financial law. Ministry Wizarding Court jurisdiction does not apply to accounts held under this framework. The Malfoy challenge has no standing. We have already informed their attorney. She filed the confirmation under a folder labeled their second mistake. Outside the library window, the Welsh hills were green with early summer. Somewhere in London, a man in extremely expensive robes was reading a letter from a goblin that represented, in the understated way of goblins, the most complete financial annihilation he had ever received, delivered in 3 paragraphs and a complimentary closing. Lily poured fresh tea. There were 5 more items on the day's list. Snape's letter arrived in September of Harry's 4th year, 3 weeks before the Beauxbatons carriage and the Durmstrang ship were due at Hogwarts. It was short, 4 sentences. The 4th was the one that mattered. The mechanism they are building requires a champion. The goblet cannot be fooled by an age line. It can, however, be preempted. Lily read it twice at the kitchen table in Grimmauld Place, where she had been working since August on the Ministry Inquiry documentation. She thought for approximately 90 seconds. Then she went to the library and pulled the oldest text she had on Triwizard Tournament law, a slim handwritten volume from the late 13th century, found in the Potter collection years earlier, and flagged without yet knowing why. She found the relevant section in 11 minutes. The Sovereign Heir Submission. Written into the original tournament compact at the insistence of the ancient houses, who had refused to participate in any competitive magical framework that didn't recognize their right to name an heir as champion directly. The provision had never been formally repealed. It had simply not been invoked since the 15th century, when the last ancient house sovereign to use it had named her daughter as champion, and her daughter had won. The Goblet of Fire was bound to magical law, not ministry policy. It predated the ministry by 200 years. It would recognize the provision because it had no mechanism for otherwise. She wrote 2 submission letters, sealed them with the Peverell crest, and sent them by man or owl to the goblet's custodian at the Department of Magical Games and Sports, where they would be logged, dated, and legally binding before anyone at Hogwarts knew they existed. Then she wrote back to Snape, "Thank you. I've handled it. Watch Moody." Sirius, reading over her shoulder, said, "You did this the day the tournament announcement came out, didn't you?" "The same afternoon," she said. "Of course you did." He straightened. "I'll make tea. Close the curtain when you leave. I have 3 more letters." The night the goblet selected its champions, the Great Hall held the pressure of a room that had been wound tight for weeks and was finally releasing. Cedric Diggory's name came first, on a slip of red parchment, and the Hogwarts table produced the noise of a crowd that was genuinely pleased. Fleur Delacour emerged from the goblet's flames with the composure of someone who had expected nothing less. Victor Crumb's name brought a low, appreciative murmur from the Durmstrang delegation and a ripple of impressed attention from the rest of the hall. Then the goblet went quiet. The judges at the head table waited with the patience of people who knew this process. The goblet flared, not red, gold, deep, sustained gold, a different category of color than what had come before, older looking, as though the flame itself was operating from a different set of instructions. 2 slips of parchment emerged simultaneously, which the goblet had never done in living memory, burning gold at their edges as they fell into Dumbledore's hands. He read the first. He read the second. His expression moved through several configurations quickly, and arrived at something Lily, watching from the gallery above, recognized as the face he made when reality had declined to behave according to his planning. "Harry James Potter," he said, "and Hermione Jean Granger Potter, sovereign heirs of the ancient house of Potter." The hall went completely still for 3 seconds. Then it came apart. Not cleanly, not as one response, but as 400 different responses happening simultaneously. The Hogwarts students divided between confusion and something that was complicated and proud. The Durmstrang delegation conferred in rapid undertones. Madame Maxine turned to her students with the expression of someone recalculating a competition she had thought she understood. At the Gryffindor table, Ron Weasley looked at the empty seats where Harry and Hermione had been sitting and said, to no one in particular, "They knew, didn't they? They absolutely knew." Nobody disagreed with him. The judge's challenge lasted 40 minutes, and was never a real challenge. Lily presented the 13th century compact, the sovereign heir provision, the dated submission letters, and the 2-page legal summary Cassius Moon had prepared in August against the possibility that someone would attempt to argue the point. The tournament's own rulebook contained no clause superseding a founding compact. The goblet's acceptance was itself legal confirmation. The goblet was the tournament's highest authority on eligibility, and it had burned gold. The judges accepted this because they had no mechanism for otherwise. The first task was dragons. Harry received his information from Hagrid the same way the other champions did. Hagrid, who could not keep a secret that excited him regardless of who was watching or what the occasion was. Harry listened, thanked him, and went to find Hermione. They sat in the library that evening and approached the problem not as a question of suppression or combat, but as a question of environment. The dragon was not the obstacle. The dragon was a creature responding to a situation it hadn't chosen. The obstacle was the golden egg. The Hungarian horntail is the most territorial of the four, Hermione said, but territorial responses are triggered by perceived threat. If you don't register as one— I won't, Harry said. She looked up from her notes. The old magic in a calming working reads as warm, he said. It's the same quality Seraphine responded to when Mum went into the chamber. Magically attuned animals recognize it. Hermione wrote something down with the decisive stroke of a person adding a confirmed variable to a calculation. I'll manage the perimeter, a runic anchor array, same structure as the chamber working, modified for an open space. If the other eggs are warded, the horntail's attention will divide. 4 anchors, Harry said. North, south, the 2 diagonals. Give me 6 minutes before you enter. The arena was loud with the particular noise of people who had come to watch something dangerous, and were getting what they paid for. The horntail was chained at the far end, 60 feet of muscle and scale, and the absolute focus of a creature with a nest inside its radius. Hermione moved along the outer edge, invisible to anyone watching the dragon, and inscribed the 4 anchor runes on the stone perimeter in under 5 minutes. The ward went up without sound or light. The horntail's chain went slack by 3 inches as the territorial boundary shifted slightly outward. Harry walked in. The horntail saw him immediately. Its head came up, neck extending, deciding between threat responses. The crowd's noise dropped by half a register. He walked toward it, not quickly, not with anything raised, with a pace that communicated in the language that predates speech, that he was not running and not attacking and not afraid. He raised his right hand, open, palm forward, the horntail's head lowered by 18 inches. He placed his hand against the side of its jaw. The arena went completely silent. The horntail was still, not subdued, still, the way a creature goes still when something in its environment produces a sensation it recognizes but cannot categorize. What it felt was not a threat, and not a handler, and not a command. It felt like being addressed correctly, in the right register, with the right intention behind it. Harry walked past it to the golden egg. He picked it up. He walked back. The sequence took 31 seconds. In the judge's enclosure, Dumbledore's hands were folded on the table, and his expression was the expression of a man watching something he had not planned for arrive precisely on schedule, which was, Lily thought, watching from her seat, an expression she had seen on him before. Hermione was already at the arena's edge, notebook open, recording the modifications that had performed above projection. The ward held at full load, she said, when Harry reached her. The ward was good. I know. She turned the egg, examining its seam. The clue is acoustic. We'll need water. They walked back toward the champion's tent together, and the crowd was still making noise above and around them, and neither of them looked up at it. Harry's scar flared on a Tuesday evening in early June. Not the monthly pulse that Lily monitored and managed, but something different, a directional pressure lasting 4 seconds before the containment reasserted. He was in the library when it happened. He sat very still for a moment, then went to find her. She was already in the corridor. She had felt it through the blood anchor, not the same sensation, but its shadow, the way sound carries through a wall. She looked at him when he came around the corner, and the look between them was the look of 2 people who had been preparing for a specific moment for a long time, and had just been told the moment had a date. He's ready, she said. Where? Little Hangleton, the Riddle Graveyard. She had been tracking the Shade's movements through Snape's intelligence for 8 months, and the graveyard had appeared twice, a place with residual dark magic connected to the Riddle bloodline, where the specific ritual of restoration could be performed. He has a servant. He's been building toward this since the tournament announcement. When? Within the week. He needs the bone from his father's grave, and that's where it is. She met his eyes. We go first. She called the 4 of them together that evening at the kitchen table in Wales, because the kitchen was where they had always made decisions that mattered. Sirius had his hands flat on the table and was listening with the total attention he had developed in the years since Azkaban. the attention of someone who had learned that the planning stage was where you prevented the worst outcomes. Not in the execution. Lily spread a graveyard map across the table, obtained from a Muggle records office 8 months ago and studied since. The graveyard needs to be caged before he rises. Sirius, full range, animagus form, eyes on every exit. Nothing leaves that graveyard unaccounted for. He nodded once. Hermione, the outer ward ring. Same anchor structure as the arena, modified for a closed space. The stone wall backs 3 of the 4 anchors. The 4th needs a freestanding post. Silver core, Peveril worked. Northeast corner first, before anything else. Hermione was already annotating the map. Harry. She waited until he looked at her fully, not at the map. Your job is not to fight him. Your job is to hold his attention while I work. Can you do that? Yes, he said. He'll come at you hard. He has always believed you are the prophecy's center, the child the scar marks, the variable that defines his own mortality. He will not understand what I'm doing because what I'm doing is not something he has encountered in 50 years of studying magic. Good, Harry said. Sirius looked between them. And if the ritual completes before the wards are up, then he rises into a cage. Lily said, which is acceptable. The cage is the point. Little Hangleton at 2 a.m. was the kind of dark that had been accumulating in a place for centuries. Yew trees at the perimeter, stone markers in uneven rows. At the far end, the riddle grave, white marble maintained with the care of someone who visited it with deliberate regularity. They moved through the gate without speaking. Hermione went to the northeast corner first, the silver core post under her arm, and had it seated and the anchor rune inscribed in under 4 minutes. She moved to the south wall. Harry took the east anchor. Lily laid the west. Sirius dissolved into Padfoot and was gone into the dark between the trees. The outer ward sealed when Lily pressed the final activation rune into the stone. She felt it close, not with sound or light, but with the sensation of a structure becoming load-bearing. Anything attempting to leave through it would find the boundary as solid as the walls anchoring it. At the far end of the graveyard, a figure was already moving. Peter Pettigrew worked with the efficiency of someone following exact instructions he had rehearsed many times. The cauldron was in place. The fire beneath it burned without light, dark ritual flame, the color of the absence of color. Lily watched from behind the east wall's yew tree. The outer ward was up. The inner circle, a tighter ring, blood-anchored to her own core, drawn around the ritual site, needed 30 more seconds. She sent Hermione the signal through the blood anchor, a brief pressure like a hand on the shoulder. Hermione started the inner circle from the south. Peter dropped bone into the cauldron, white, old from the riddle grave. The dark flame expanded, the ritual accelerated. 20 seconds. Peter drew a knife. Lily was already moving. She inscribed the final anchor of the inner circle into the ground with her bare hand. No wand. The old magic running directly from her core through her palm into the earth, leaving no wand signature and no ministry trace. The circle closed. The cauldron boiled over. The thing that rose was not immediately Voldemort. It was a shape becoming Voldemort. Tall, pale, angular, the features assembling themselves from the ritual's dark output, like a face clarifying in smoke, that had decided to be solid. It straightened. It drew its first breath in 13 years. It opened its eyes, red, catching the dark flame. It took in the graveyard with the systematic attention of a brilliant mind reorienting after long displacement. The trees, the markers, Peter motionless in the grass, the cauldron cooling, then the invisible pressure of the inner circle, then the subtler, vaster pressure of the outer ward. It stood very still. Then it found Lily Evans Potter standing 10 feet away. The silence that followed was not long, but it had weight, the weight of a very fast mind arriving at a calculation it had not prepared for, and running it twice because the first result was not possible. You, Voldemort said. His voice was exactly as she remembered. Soft, precise. The voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that volume was for people who lacked better tools. You were supposed to be dead. I had other plans, Lily said. He struck. The curse left his wand as a bolt of sickly light and hit the blood anchor at the edge of the inner circle, and dissolved, not with force, not with a counterstrike, but with the response of a substance meeting something it could not remain coherent against. The anchor was not a shield, it was a medium. The curse passed into it and was simply no longer a curse. Voldemort looked at the space where it had been. Harry, Lily said, without turning. Harry stepped into the inner circle from the east. Hermione took the south point. Voldemort's attention moved to Harry with the inevitability of something that had been tracking this point for 14 years, and Harry looked back with the clear, grounded attention of someone who had never been required to understand himself through this man's eyes, and was not about to start. Voldemort began to cast, and Lily began to work. The sacrificial core working was not loud, not visible, and produced nothing that anyone watching the wrong thing would notice. What it was, 15 years of love magic transmuted through alchemical discipline into a targeted solvent. Not a weapon, but a solvent, calibrated to the structure of a soul fragment held in place against its nature. A Horcrux was a piece of a soul that did not want to be what it was. What Lily had built was the working that recognized that unwillingness and answered it. She extended her awareness outward through the magical substrate beneath ordinary space, where the blood anchor already ran. The locket first, in a cave on the Scottish coast, heavy gold in a basin of dark water. The fragment dissolved. Not the locket, the thing inside it, the piece of a soul held there against its nature for 30 years. It simply stopped being held. The ring next, in a ruined shack in the village around them, the old gaunt dwelling, little Hangleton's oldest ruin. It dissolved. The cup was in the Lestrange vault, which presented a different problem. Bellatrix had been convicted and imprisoned following the First War, and certain Lestrange assets had passed into ministry-supervised receivership. Lily had spent 2 years navigating Gringotts' own governance channels, working through formal seizure records that existed independently of any family's consent, to establish access through legitimate goblin financial law. The cup dissolved. The diadem was in a room at Hogwarts she had located in the spring, the room of requirement, on which Seraphine had provided architectural detail going back to the castle's foundations. It dissolved. Voldemort felt them going. She knew because the inner circle was close enough that the working conducted his responses back like sound through water. Each dissolution was a note. 5 notes in sequence, each lower than the last. The baseline of a man discovering that the architecture of his immortality was coming apart in real time. He stopped casting at Harry. He turned to Lily. "What are you doing?" he said. His voice was still soft, but the softness had changed, not the softness of a man with better tools than volume. The softness of a man whose breath had shifted into something new. "Ending it," Lily said. She reached for the last external fragment. Nagini was in the trees at the graveyard's north edge. The fragment clung inside the snake the way a parasite clings, integrated with a living system. She found it. The working recognized it and answered. It dissolved. Voldemort made a sound from below. Language. The sound a man makes when he has spent 50 years building a structure against his own mortality and has just felt the last support fail. Standing in a graveyard at 2 a.m, with his wand in his hand and the woman who had survived him twice standing 10 feet away, he was mortal, and the knowing of it was on his face in a way that nothing could prevent. He looked at her. "There's one left," he said. He meant the scar. He meant Harry. "I know," Lily said. The graveyard was quiet. The dark flame had gone out when Peter lost consciousness, and the only light now was the natural light of a June night. Enough to see by, not enough to see everything. The marble of the riddle grave caught what light there was and held it. Voldemort stood in the inner circle with his wand at his side and his eyes on Harry's scar. Harry stood 12 feet away and did not move. Lily stepped into the space between them, not to shield, to work. "Mum?" Harry said. She turned her head slightly, acknowledging without breaking focus. "I know what you're about to do," he said. "It's in my scar. You've been containing it since I was 7. I've known since I was 12. You told me." "I told you," she said, "because you deserved the truth." Voldemort raised his wand. Harry raised his hand, and the wandless working that came from it was not a shield and not a curse. A sustained pressure, the old magic at full extension, hitting Voldemort's casting arm with enough force to deflect the wand's angle by 30 degrees. The curse went into the ground 6 feet to Harry's left, and the earth there went black and cold and stayed that way. "I need 2 minutes," Lily said. "I've got 2 minutes," Harry said. The extraction method had no name. Lily had developed it over 14 months, from a theoretical framework in the oldest alchemical text she owned, building outward through blood anchor mechanics and Peverell documents on death threshold working. She had run the calculations with Hermione until Hermione had looked up from the parchment at 2 a.m. and said, quietly, The theory is sound, which was what Lily had needed to hear from the most precise mind available to her before she would attempt it on her son. 3 things were required: the blood anchor at full extension, the sacrificial core working calibrated to the fragment's depth and integration, and the absolute certainty of the person performing the extraction that the host would survive. The last requirement was not metaphorical. The working read intent. She extended the blood anchor inward, toward Harry, toward the scar, toward the cold presence she had monitored monthly for 7 years. She found it, smaller than it had been even a year ago, because the containment had been working, and the external fragments were gone, and a Horcrux in isolation, without the network of others to draw coherence from. Contracted, cold and still and, beneath everything, afraid. Not Voldemort's fear. Something older, the fear of a piece of a soul held in place by force for 14 years that had never, not once, wanted to be what it was. She recognized that fear from the texts. A Horcrux was not a triumph over death. It was a wound, self-inflicted, and the fragment was not preserved so much as trapped. She let it feel the warmth of the working, releasing, not punishing, and felt it go still in a different way, not resistant. Waiting, she applied the sacrificial core. Harry felt it as warmth beginning at the scar and moving inward. Not painful, the opposite of painful, which was its own kind of shock. He had lived with the scar's cold presence for as long as he could remember, and had learned to work around it the way you work around something that has always been there. He hadn't known, until this moment, how cold it had always been. The warmth moved through, and found the fragment, and the fragment did not fight. It let go. He put his hand to his forehead, not because it hurt, but because the absence of something that had been there since he was 15 months old was a physical fact that deserved acknowledging. The scar went cold, then warm, then only skin. He stood in the graveyard with his eyes closed, and the night was very quiet, and he was, for the first time in his life, only himself. Voldemort had stopped trying to cast. He felt the last fragment go, the one he had believed was his insurance, the thing that made the boy unable to be fully used against him. He felt it dissolve with the same quality as the others. Not pain exactly, but something like going deaf. And it had been happening incrementally for 7 minutes, one foundation at a time, and now it was complete. He was 67 years old in the way a man is 67 who has spent 30 of those years as a wraith subsisting on the magical residue of other beings. Mortal and compromised, and standing in a graveyard with no Horcruxes, and a body rebuilt from a ritual that had been interrupted before it was properly sealed. He looked at her. What was on her face was not triumph. He had expected triumph. Expected the face of an enemy who had won, which he knew how to respond to. What was on her face was something else, something he recognized, after a moment, with the part of him that had once been Tom Riddle before Tom Riddle decided what to do with himself. The look of someone finishing something long overdue. You built yourself on death. She said, 7 times you split yourself open to hold it off. And none of it, not one fragment, not one object, was you surviving. It was you refusing to arrive at the place you'd been running from since you were 11 years old. He said nothing. You could have been extraordinary, she said. Tom Riddle, the actual one. Slughorn told me once he'd never seen a student like you. A pause. He said the same about me. I've spent 15 years thinking about what the difference was. Don't, he said, very quietly. I'm not saying it for your comfort. I'm saying it because the working requires me to understand what I'm ending. And what I'm ending is a 70-year mistake that a frightened boy made and that a great many people paid for with everything they had. She raised her hand, open, palm forward, and released the working. Tom Marvolo Riddle died in a graveyard in Little Hangleton, without grandeur, without a speech, without the universe pausing, the way a fire dies when the last fuel is gone, without drama, without remainder. He fell the way mortal things fall, forward, and then still. The cold dispersed outward until the night was simply the temperature of a June night in Yorkshire, ordinary and smelling of grass and old stone. Lily stood in the graveyard for a long time. Behind her, Harry had sat down on the low stone wall at the graveyard's edge. Hermione was beside him, her shoulder against his, not speaking. Sirius had come in from the perimeter in human form and was standing at the gate with his hands in his pockets and his face doing several things at once, that he wasn't trying to conceal from anyone. The Riddle grave was very white in the pre-dawn gray. Harry looked at the back of his mother's head, The red hair, the precise posture, the stillness of someone who had arrived at the end of a very long road and was taking a moment to understand that she had in fact arrived, that this was what arrival felt like. "Mum," he said. She turned. He held out his hand. Not a child's gesture. He was 14, with his father's hands now broad and capable and trained. But the gesture was entirely the gesture of a person who knew, in their body and their unquestioned understanding of themselves, that they were safe, that they had always been going to be safe, that someone had stood between them and everything coming and had not moved. She crossed the graveyard and took his hand. They stood there for a moment, all four of them, in the particular quiet of people who have done something enormous and are allowing themselves to be still inside it. "Your father," Lily said, "would have loved this." "The winning?" Harry said. "The not dying part. He was very strongly in favor of not dying." Somewhere in the trees, a bird began, early, tentative, testing whether the night was over yet. It was. The Wizengamot inquiry lasted 3 days. Not because the evidence was complicated. The evidence was the least complicated thing in the room. Lily had been building the case since the early months at the manor, and what she presented on the first morning was not an argument but an accounting. Documented failures, named individuals, specific dates, the precise chain of decisions that had allowed a war to happen, and then allowed its aftermath to be managed as a public relations problem, rather than a reckoning. She stood at the floor of the chamber for 6 hours on the first day and did not raise her voice once. The portraits of previous ministers watched from the gallery. Wizengamot members, who had been present during the First War, sat with the stillness of people waiting to find out how much was known about them. The ones too young to have been there sat forward, the posture of people encountering the shape of something they had always sensed but never seen documented. On the second day she presented the wrongful imprisonment cases. 41 individuals. She read every name aloud with dates of imprisonment and the procedural failure that had allowed each case to proceed without trial. Sirius Black's case was among the first. So was the documented account of Peter Pettigrew's capture and confession, extracted in the weeks following Little Hangleton through means she had been preparing for years. It took 2 hours. The chamber was silent for all of it, in the way rooms are silent when silence is the only adequate response. On the third day she presented 12 reform proposals, sequenced in the order of dependency, an independent oversight body for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a mandatory trial requirement for any detention exceeding 72 hours, a press integrity statute with genuine enforcement mechanisms, a formal review of Azkaban's conditions with a binding timeline for replacing the Dementor security apparatus with something that did not feed on the suffering of people who had not yet been found guilty of anything. Cornelius Fudge resigned during the lunch recess. His secretary delivered the letter to the Wizengamot's clerk, while the chamber was empty, which was either cowardice or a final act of political calculation, and Lily found she did not particularly need to determine which. The reform proposals went to vote that afternoon. She sat in the ancient house gallery and watched the hands go up, and did not count until it was over, because she had done enough counting in advance and she knew the numbers. All 12 passed. Amelia Bones became Minister for Magic on a Thursday in November. The ceremony was brief, which was her preference. Lily attended, shook her hand, and left before the reception because she had a Gringotts oversight meeting at 4 o'clock, and Iron Scale did not reschedule for anyone. Sovereign Counselor, Amelia had said the week before, over tea in the office that had been Fudge's. It's not a current position. It's in the Founders' Compact, Lily said. Section 9. Not used since the 17th century. I've prepared the reinstatement documentation. Amelia had looked at her with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to argue a point, and had decided against it. Of course you have, she said. Snape received his Order of Merlin, first class, at a small ceremony in December. He accepted it with the expression of a man examining an accounting he knew was not entirely correct, but had decided not to dispute. He taught for 3 more years, then submitted his resignation to Headmistress McGonagall, who had taken the position that autumn and suited it in the way the right person suits the right institution, in a letter characteristically precise and entirely without sentiment. He did not leave entirely. He returned in the springs to run a 2-week advanced potions intensive for 6th and 7th years, and the students who attended it were, without exception, changed by it in ways they spent years afterward trying to put into words. He and Lily had tea twice a year. They talked about research, The past was a place they had both been to, and had both, in different ways, departed, and they did not feel the need to revisit it. It was enough. It was considerably more than enough. 10 years after Little Hangleton, Erie Manor in summer, full in the way it had not been when it was only Lily and a baby and the sound of Welsh wind and old stone. The Weasleys came in 3 cars, and an enchanted Van Arthur had been modifying since before it was legal. Molly arrived with a dish the kitchen accepted as an addition rather than a rival. Jean and Dan Granger were in the garden. Jean with her book, Dan wearing the expression of a man who had spent 10 years being welcomed by a world he hadn't been born into, and had simply chosen to be grateful for it, every time, without reservation. Neville was by the wall, showing Frank and Alice the manor's herb beds, Frank leaning forward over the rosemary with the focused interest of a man for whom the world was becoming legible again, one detail at a time. Alice holding a sprig of lavender and smiling at something she did not explain. Luna had arrived from South America with research notes on 3 newly documented species, and the serene conviction that the 4th was still out there. She had already told Hermione about all 3, and was now telling Ginny, who listened with genuine attention and asked extremely good questions. Sirius was in the kitchen doing something to a roast that required no assistance, supervised through the window by Molly with diplomatic neutrality. Draco Malfoy, who had arrived with a letter of introduction from Sirius, which contained an entire history in its brevity, stood slightly apart from the group in the way of someone learning to belong somewhere without a template for it. Neville had handed him gardening gloves and started talking about time propagation, which was precisely the right move, and Draco was listening with the careful attention of someone who recognized an unexpected lifeline. Ron and Harry were arguing cheerfully about something near the fence. Hermione was making a point to Dan about the legislation she was revising. She was 23, High Chancellor of Magical Education, having proposed the role herself in a 12-page document Amelia Bones had approved the following morning. Dan wore the expression he always wore when his daughter made him understand something he hadn't known he needed. The same expression Jean wore watching Hermione from across a room. Recognition, pride, the deep satisfaction of watching someone become completely, fully themselves. Snape was in the garden reading, his chair placed at a precise distance from the nearest people. Nobody disturbed him. He turned pages. Occasionally he looked up at the garden with the expression of a man who had not expected, at this stage of his life, to be spending a summer afternoon in one, and found the experience acceptable in a way he had not anticipated. Harry was laughing at something Sirius called through the kitchen window. Lily stood on the front steps with her tea. She had built this. Not the manor, that had stood for 300 years. The people in it. The shape of the afternoon, the particular fact that all of them were alive and here, and well, which had not been a given, which had required years of planning and research, and the willingness to spend a decade being dead to the world, in order for the world to eventually become this. She went inside. There were books she hadn't read yet. There was always the next thing, the next reform, the next conversation that needed to happen between the right people, at the right time to move something important forward by another inch. Not a monument, not a triumph, but a foundation. The thing you build so that the people standing on it don't have to think about what's underneath them, so they can simply stand. They were standing on it. All of them. She went to the library. She sat in the chair she had sat in since Harry was 11 months old, and the night was dark, and she had not yet known what she was building. Only that she was building it and that she would not stop. She opened a book. Outside, someone laughed. The sound came through the old stone walls and settled into the library the way good sounds settle into old houses, completely without remainder, as though it had been on its way here the entire time. She was supposed to be a ghost. She had chosen to be something the world hadn't named yet. She turned the page. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.